Hi, and a very warm welcome to this panel on emerging best practices for predictive model development and use. My name is Lindqvist-McGowan, and I have the pleasure of serving as moderator for today's session on behalf of the Violence Early Warning System VIEWS here at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. With me today, we have 5 panelists calling in from Sweden, Norway, UK, and Lebanon to discuss the recent developments in data-driven conflict forecasting and how these groundbreaking solutions can be applied and used not only by the academic community, but perhaps most importantly by practitioners, policymakers, and other stakeholders working at the intersection of peace and security, human rights, and development. From the research community, we will hear from Professor Håvard Hege and Dr. Paula Vesco from Uppsala University, and from Professor Niels Metternick from University College London. From the polity sector or practitioners community participating today in their personal capacity, we will also hear from Dr. Yusuf Shaipani and Mr. Joaquin Salido Marcos from the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, UNESCO. At the end of today's panel, we will also open the floor to questions from the audience, so please feel free to type in any questions you may have into the chat window throughout the session, and we will revert back to these towards the end of the hour. Now, without further ado, I will leave the floor to our first Violence Early Warning System reviews and a presentation of the most recent developments in the projects. Speaking is Professor Håvard Hege, Dag Hammarskjöld Professor in Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, a project leader for the VIEWS project. Professor Hege, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Angelica. I will share a screen. Thanks for this opportunity to talk a bit about lessons learned from the VIEWS project. The VIEWS project has been in operation for 5 years, and I'll just show you a couple of highlights from what we've been working on and from what we've learned in terms of producing early warning, pushing the early warning system of use. So this is my presentation, but this is on behalf of the VIEWS team, some of whom are on this panel already. So thanks to everybody who's contributed to what I'm presenting here. So first, what is VIEWS? Just a second. Sorry, I can't see my slide. So what is VIEWS? So VIEWS is an early warning system that predicts incidents of organized political violence 36 months into the future. So the VIEWS system makes forecasts for 3 forms of violence as coded by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. So the most important form of violence is state-based armed conflict between 2 parties, of which at least one is a government. 2 other forms of violence that the USDP is coding are one-sided violence, so that's violence by a government or an organized group against unarmed civilians, and non-state conflict between 2 organized non-governmental armed groups. So this state-based armed conflict category is most important because in most cases, one-sided violence and non-state conflict occurs in the context of state-based armed conflict. So the VIEWS system seeks to forecast both the onset and the continuation and the de-escalation of violence. So the target for the forecast are whether there is an instance of armed conflict in a geographic location or at a country in a given month. So we seek to have maximal transparency, so only use publicly available and uniform data and open source code, and also seek to use input data that are no more than 1 month old in the case where the original sources are updated frequently, and not more than 1 year in the cases where there's any updates. So I'll just give you a very brief glimpse into some of the lessons learned. I'll talk about forecasting multiple steps ahead. So VIEWS has learned that different models are required when forecasting 3 months into the future and when forecasting 3 years. I'll tell you a bit about what we do in order to solve that challenge. Talk a bit about model ensembles, briefly define wisdom of the crowd and what that means and how we use that to help us. talk a bit about structured evaluation procedures and the practices that we established to do that. That implies rolling windows for multiple steps and retrospective evaluation. And we also have an ongoing expert survey. I probably won't have time to talk about that, but if there is interest in the Q&A, I can talk more about it. So first, forecasting multiple steps ahead. So as I said, models that are optimal when forecasting 3 months ahead are not optimal when forecasting 36 months into the future. So what we do in views is to train models separately for each step ahead. So we have a set of models that give optimized predictions for forecasting 3 months ahead, or 6 months, or 12 months ahead, or 36 months ahead. And we also estimate ensemble weights separately for each step. So I'll get to the ensemble construction in views in a second. So you can see the two maps here shows the forecast for state-based conflict based on the most recent data from March 2021. For the map to the left shows the predicted probability of armed conflict in geographical location for June 2021, 3 months from the last point of data, and the forecast for March 2024. So you can see that what's optimal forecast in our evaluation is quite different at 3 years into the future than 3 months into the future. We'll talk a bit about why this is so in a second. We're using ensembles, as I said. So what's that? It's the realization that multiple models together perform better than single models. So what we do in views is to formulate forecasting models that might be thematic, or they might use a special methodology or to capture some idea about how to best construct a prediction model. But all models are partial and imperfect. And what research shows is that multiple models together perform better than single models. Ensembles are also better the more diverse the models are. So in views, we try to think of new models that are capturing different signals from the data, different images of the elusive truth, if you like. Ensembles also helps avoiding overfitting, the problem that some models might just fit very well to the data used for training and not really predictive future rather well. So ensembles is another layer of protection against overfitting because it evens out the impact of individual models. It can also help interpretation, as I will talk a bit about in a second. So we do this by training different models that provide probabilistic forecasts, so estimates of the probability of conflict in a country in a month, or the probability of conflict in a geographic location in a month, and just compute the weighted average of these probabilities from each model. We find the optimal weights by setting aside some data separately for that purpose, and to identify the optimal weights that we use. And as I said, these optimal weights, they can differ from ensemble, which is specializing in 3 months ahead predictions, and those specializing in 36 months ahead predictions. For instance, one thing we do in views is to develop in some thematic models. We have, for instance, models for conflict history, for socioeconomic development, for political institutions, for elections, for drought vulnerability. I also have some broad models. And having these thematic models can help interpretation because we can extract prediction maps for each model, which is trained using some pretty specific thematic variables, look at how those predictions look, and then consider how they contribute to the prediction for a given country, for instance. So here we show you the prediction maps for a past run for 1 month ahead, the conflict history model to the left, which has yields high predictabilities in countries with recent conflict. Then we have a socioeconomic development model, which tends to produce high probabilities in poor countries, and a political institutions model, which tends to produce high predictabilities in half democracies, countries with poor civil liberties, poor rule of law, etc. So one lesson learned that we've been grappling with is how to evaluate when data are sparse. So armed conflict is fortunately a rare event. And the gold standard for forecasting is to train one part of the data and evaluate performance in others. So when the armed conflict events are fairly rare, we need to split data between training and evaluation, how to make best use of available data. So what we do is to have a rolling window for multiple steps. What we do, leave the future out evaluation. So we train for data up to 2017 and set aside data for instance, 2018 to 2020. So we train the models to 2017, make predictions as if we were in December 2017, and evaluate how these predictions work for 2018 to 2020. But we also, while doing that, we also time shift so that we a set of forecasts 3 months into the future are evaluated for all the 36 months in 2018 to 2020. So we produce forecasts for that target January 2018, February 2018, March 2018, and so forth, all the way to December 2020, and average over that. That gives us 36 times as much data for evaluation as if we would only doing the prediction from December 2017. So another thing we've been doing for transparency and for evaluation purposes is to do retrospective evaluation. So we looked to all the forecasts that we published from July 2018 up to December 2019 against what really happened. And we've found that the performance is close to what our auto-sample evaluation indicates. So we think it's really valuable to be publishing the forecast at the regular intervals and making them publicly available, so that it's possible to do this true auto-sample out the true prediction for the future evaluation afterwards. Just quickly about interpreting predictions. For the immediate future, we find that conflict history is most important, but for them predicting 3 years out, development of democracy is most important. So we reached this conclusion by looking at the thematic models in our ensemble. So what this figure here shows is the extent to which the predictions improve if we add a given model to the ensemble. And so when we add the conflict history model, the performance of the ensemble improves considerably. When we add, especially when you only predict 3 months into the future. If you want to predict 36 months into the future, that's the rightmost bar in this figure. When we add the socioeconomic development model, with data from world development indicators, the performance of the model improves the most. And we can use that to interpret what lies behind the predictions for individual countries. So to the top left here, this is the relative importance for the prediction of each of these thematic models for the country of Nigeria. So you can see that this is a run where we predict for from 2020, January 2020 up and 3 years into the future. When we predict only a few months into the future, conflict history is more important. But as we for the predictions further out, what really drives the estimate of a high risk in Nigeria is in particular the socioeconomic development situation in Nigeria. So that was just a quick glimpse into some of the lessons learned in the USE project over the past year or two. I'll leave the floor to next panelist. Thanks.
Thank you kindly, Professor Hegre. Building on to this presentation, we will now leave the floor to Dr. Paula Vesco, a postdoctoral researcher also with the USE project at Uppsala University. She will discuss how broad collaborations across diverse scientific teams can encourage considerable improvements in our collective ability to forecast violence, as exemplified by a recent forecasting competition she helped organize for the USE project. Dr. Vesco?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Angelica, for the introduction, and thank you for organizing this panel. So I'm gonna present today on behalf of the VIEWS team, some lessons that we learned from a prediction competition that we organized in autumn last year to encourage improvements in predicting the change in fatalities. So I'm sorry, this is not optimal. Okay, well. So the motivation for this prediction competition is that there has been increasing research in forecasting of conflict, and this research has especially increased after the realization that only relying on simple functional forms and in-sample testing of model performance is not really helpful when it comes to predict violence. And this research, especially in the last 5 years, has leveraged innovation based on machine learning, computational advances, and data collection efforts, and has achieved meaningful progresses in forecasting violence. Yet most of these models try to forecast incidents or onset of conflict, and they also tend to be surprised by changes in fatalities. Predicting changes in the level of fatalities is especially challenging, and I will discuss this a bit more in detail later on. But being able to predict changes in both direction when conflict escalate or de-escalate is also very scientifically and politically relevant. And so to encourage improvements in our ability to forecast changes, we organized this prediction competition, and we invited researchers from very different teams to present models that are able to forecast changes upwards or downwards in the number of fatalities from state-based conflict as defined by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. And you see in the formulation that we set up for this task, we wanted to uplift, to give more importance to the ability to correctly predict new conflicts or conflicts that scale down to zero. So why in this formula is the level of fatalities aggregated to the country months or the disaggregated geographical level, so the PRIO-grid month unit. We asked participants to forecast for 3 different tasks, but the main task was to predict the change in violence for the period October 2020 up to March 2021, and to improve upon a benchmark model that we at Views provided. The participants were asked to use were allowed to use all the training and calibration data up to August 2020, and the deadline for submission was September last year. And so we asked participants to forecast at least 6 steps ahead. And this gave us much more data to provide a more accurate evaluation, as for Howard has explained in the introduction. Here you see in the slides that we received many different contributions, both at the country level and at the peer grid level. And the contributions, for example, presented new data based on information extracted from the news, Wikipedia statistics and topic saliency. They also presented new models like recurrent neural networks, ensemble of different algorithms, and data relying on expert surveys. And similarly, at the PRIO-grid level, they presented new algorithms like dynamic time warping, convolutional neural networks, and state space models. So if you look at the maps, here it's just to showcase some of the predictions at the country month level for March 2021. This shows the change in the level of fatality compared to August 2020, the last month of data. And you see that the models are quite different in the prediction, but they also tend to have some overlaps. They tend to agree on an increasing conflict for March 2021 in Libya, to a less extent also in Egypt and Algeria, and also in Niger and Chad. And they tend to predict a de-escalation of conflict in Mozambique, especially. And if we zoom in the disaggregated level, you see that the differences are even more substantial. So for example, if you look at the model 4, the one that is at the geographic level that uses peacekeeping operations data, it tends to predict a very strong increase in violence for March 2021 in the region across the border of Cameroon and Chad, and similarly in the north of Mozambique. But for example, the state space model, model 5 in the slide, it tends to predict a de-escalation of violence in the same location. And again, model 8 that uses geographic level data based on PRIO-grid and extreme gradient boosting, it tends to predict, and this is quite different compared to other models, it tends to predict a de-escalation of violence in Nigeria. And so in order to exploit this unique and distinct aspects of each and every model in the competition, we put together an ensemble of predictions, and we weighted this ensemble by the accuracy of the models in the test set. So as I said, participants were also asked to predict for different tasks, and one task was to predict for a test set, and this enabled us to provide an evaluation of the forecast, which is more accurate than the evaluation for the period up to March 2021. And we used the test set also to compute the error of the models in the predictions. And we used this error as a weight for the ensemble into the future. And here you see the prediction again for March 2021 based on the ensemble, and the triangles in the left map shows the actual change from what we know from the UCDP data. So the model again shows an increasing violence, predicted increasing violence in Chad, in Algeria, Libya, and Niger, and then a decrease in violence in Mozambique, especially very intense, but also in Nigeria, South Sudan, and Central African Republic. But if you look at the PRIO-grid trends, so the disaggregated predictions, there are some interesting patterns in violence that get predicted by the model. For example, in the region across the border between Nigeria and Cameroon and Chad, you see that the model tends to predict a de-escalation in the central region, but also an increase in violence in the neighboring locations. So it seems that the violence tends to spill over to neighboring locations, which is confirmed by previous research. And similar trends are also detected in the north of Mozambique and in Somalia, for example. So how did the models do in predicting conflict? These are the results of a preliminary evaluation for the true future. So we find that the models that predict the best for the country level are models that use information extracted from the news, especially because they are able to detect early signals of tensions, and models that rely on an ensemble of different algorithms. At the PRIO-grid level, models that are able to really capture the information of spatial temporal dependencies and use very complex algorithms to like auto machine learning and neural networks, they're very accurate in forecasting. And we also observe, and this is especially at when we evaluate for the test set and slightly less so for the true future, we find that the ensemble performance improves upon the individual contributions. And this might be slightly less the case for the true future, because in the case of the true future, so up to March 2021, we could only evaluate for one single month, while in the test set, we have much more data for the evaluation. But this may also indicate that some models are especially strong in predicting conflict. But a general lesson that we learned is that gathering a diverse crowd of models really generate an insight which is much more accurate than the average individual contribution. And interestingly, we also find that a naive model that tends to predict only no change over time and over space is very hard to beat by most models. So, as I said, we find that the models that perform the best tend to be very complex models, like convolutional long short-term memory networks, spatial temporal graph convolutional neural networks, and also Markov models. But at the same time, we need to complement these models with information on early signals of tension, especially useful maybe here the data on events instability that capture early signs of instability, data from the news or Wikipedia statistics, because complex models and complex algorithms perform less well in detecting in forecasting new conflicts. And this is why we need new data or data-driven models. So the lessons we learned so far from this competition is that, as expected, predicting changes in violence is much more challenging than predicting the presence or absence of conflict, and especially because it requires many different abilities from the models, including correctly forecasting the direction of this change. And models that exploit spatial temporal dependencies and are able to and have very complex algorithms being able to capture these dependencies are very insightful, but we also need to complement these complex algorithms with efforts towards an increased interpretability and new data collection efforts. And finally, the wisdom of the crowd is very important in advancing the research frontiers and leveraging new insights that relies on the unique and distinct elements of each contributions. I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have or delve deeper into some of the topics that I really only touched upon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vesco. We will now shift our focus to yet another novel innovation in predictive model development, namely the use of actor-centric model to generate yet more detailed conflict forecasts and a deeper understanding of conflict dynamics. Speaking is Professor Niels Metternick, Associate Professor at University College London in the Department of Policy.
Thank you. I hope you're hearing me well. Thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this and everyone who's listening to this. So what I will be talking about is a class of different models. So in the last presentations, we were focusing on geographic models. And so now I'm going to turn to actor models, where one is not predicting what is happening in a particular area, a geographic grid, for example, but try to predict the behavior of actual actors, might be the government or rebel organization. And I've been working on such a model. Views is working on such a model, and we also have initiatives where we try to sort of combine geographic models and actor models. So I'm just going to very quickly, in the next 8 minutes or so, talk a little bit about what we're actually predicting in these models, and we're going to focus on predicting the severity of conflict. I'll talk a little bit about why we should be making accurate predictions, and then allude a little bit of how good these predictions might be and how useful they are for the user. So so here's an example of severity, and here's an example from the UCDP GED data source, which has already been mentioned, which is also used in this project. And here you can see the casualties of fighting between the Hutu movement and the forces of Hadi in Yemen. And basically what these models that I'll be talking about are trying to do is to explain this variation. That is, when do we see periods of high conflict severity, many casualties, and when do we see periods with less casualties? And this might be particularly important for actors who are in a conflict scenario, humanitarian organizations, for example, who might have operations there, but it might also be important to monitor post-conflict situations to see which actors might actually be spoiling the peace. The issue, of course, is that in most conflicts, we're not only focusing on one sort of conflict diet or one set of actors, but like in Yemen, we have sort of many actors that are fighting. And so we're trying to make predictions for many actors. And in fact, in the models that we're presenting, we're trying to make predictions for all actors that are active in conflicts around the world. And in particular, what we're leveraging is that most of these organizations, rebel organizations, they're not fighting in a vacuum, but they're connected to other rebel organizations within the conflict, sometimes transnationally. And we're trying to leverage information from that to predict whether or not these organizations are fighting and to which severity. So just to give you a little bit of a background, sort of these actor models have been around for some time, and they usually come more from the state-based world, so predicting conflict between states. But because we have this fantastic event data from different projects, and UCDP GED is one of them, we're now in a situation where we can also make these actor prediction models on the intrastate level, that is within state conflicts. So why should we be focusing on actors, maybe compared to a geographic level? Well, first of all, sort of the three bets. One is that the data generating process is on the actor level. So it's actors who are making decisions of whether to fight or not, and not the geographic unit. So it might be sort of a better way of thinking about the data generating process when you model this. We also see the strategic dynamics on the actor, so what level rather than geographic level. So that means the propensity of one actor to fight might be conditional on other actors. And there might also be implications for peace processes. That is, who should we actually be sort of looking at during peace processes? So the models that we've been using here is, again, we're using this UCDP GED casualty data, and we're making predictions about battle deaths inflicted by the rebel organizations on the government and the government on the rebel organization. So we have separate models for that. And we distinguish 4 levels of severity. Level 0, there are no battle deaths. Level 1, 1 to 25 battle deaths in a month. Level 2, 24 to 99 battle deaths. And then level 3 is more than 100 battle deaths per month. So we're making these sort of monthly predictions about the severity. The results that I'm showing you here is just 1 month ahead models, but we also do 6 months ahead models, and these can be adjusted to user needs. What we use for making these predictions are sort of characteristics about the actors. So for example, you know, how, to which degree have they escalated in the past, which often tells us something about the strength of these actors, where rebel behavior, so to which extent, how much area are they active in, and then these interdependencies that I've talked about, that is sort of that if one rebel organization fights, it's likely that this will spill over to other organizations. And then we do sort of temporal lag structures of all these features. At the end, we have sort of 79 features. We are making predictions using random forests. We train the results that I show you are sort of trained on data from 1989 to 2009. And we're making sort of the test set results that I showed you are for a period from 2010 to 2017. We use 10-fold cross-validation, but we train such that you're learning from behavior of other rebel organizations across the cross-validation. So I'm just going to give you a little bit insight of what these models look like and what they're good at and what they're not good at. So here, what you see is on the left panel, you see predictions made from violence that the rebels inflict on the government. On the right-hand side, you see prediction models for violence that the government inflicts on the rebels. And usually what we see is that the models slightly under-predict. So I hope that you can see that. Imagine you're making a level 2 prediction in the models. What you usually see is that you're pretty good at sort of hitting the target, but there is a little bit of under-prediction happening in these models. What they're pretty good at is that if you're making, let's say, a level 2 prediction, it's very unlikely that you will have a sort of nothing happening, but sort of there can be a little bit of spillover between the categories when making these predictions. From a user perspective, what you can then do, and here we're going back to this example of Yemen, what we had at the beginning, is that if you look at these actors, so here on the left-hand side, you have Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. On the right-hand side, you have the force of Hadi. For each of these actors, you can look at the probability of level 0, level 1, level 2, and level 3, and can sort of see and make predictions for these actors on a monthly basis and have some assessment on to which degree you expect severity of conflict. I'm looking at the time. I'm aware that there should be some time left for discussion, so I'll just stop here, and I have a couple of backup slides if folks in the audience are interested in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Metternich. We will now leave the floor to a representative from the policy sector for a concluding discussion on how early warning systems can be used to improve policy and programmatic prioritization. Participating today in his personal capacity and with a presentation prepared together with Mr. Joaquin Salido Marcos.
I'll be speaking for Joaquin and myself.
I leave the Yes, I was just about to introduce
okay, go ahead.
So I leave Dr. Yusuf Shaitani, Chief of the Conflict, Occupation and Development Section within the Emerging and Conflict-Related Issues Division.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to participate. Well, deep and complex domestic discord over issues of governance, political identity, and resources, coupled with geopolitics, have rendered conflicts protracted in the MENA region. Conflicts continue to have immediate and generational life cycle impacts that in themselves exacerbate the likelihood of further violence. These dynamics are particularly visible in the Arab region, where at the beginning of 2021, over 60 million people in Iraq, Libya, Palestine, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen are in need of some form of humanitarian assistance. In recent days alone, thousands of people in Gaza have been rendered homeless. Conflicts have severely reduced local national resilience to natural disasters, climate change, and health crises, rendering the immediate and secondary impact of these crises more severe. These in themselves are risk multipliers of conflict. The need for better prevention is obvious in the MENA region. To this end, we need to better connect efforts towards peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights, which is in essence the reform of the United Nations that was initiated in 2017. One of the key motivations for this reform is the recognition that tackling the root causes of conflict is a long-term process that requires partnerships between humanitarian development and peace and security actors. Thus, it is necessary to advance a closer working dynamic where the different pillars of the multilateral system work together to take early action to prevent conflict and promote peace. But early action requires early warning. Yet the availability of rigorous, systematic, and highly quality early warning systems that objectively assess the risk of political violence at a global scale are scarce. The expansion of the political violence early warning system or views to the Arab region could offer an early warning system that is built on publicly available global and uniform data. The expansion of the views goes also beyond the geographical and brings into the model issues that are pertinent to the MENA region. Issues like water scarcity, climate shocks have been brought into the equation, linking these issues to prevention. More particularly, the various dimensions on which the model is built, including the prevalence of conflict, the governance deficit, water scarcity, food insecurity, and climate variability, serves to highlight and reiterate the importance of these issues and their relation to present and future violence patterns. Furthermore, such predictions available to a large circle of policy or decision makers that deal with peace, humanitarian, and development aspects will further strengthen responses for prevention from the humanitarian and development pillars instead of confining conflict to the strict spheres of humanitarian assistance, diplomacy, or God forbid, security. The tool could also bring into reconciliation and mediation processes the important aspects of institutional effectiveness or governance, climate, water, and food security, instead of focusing solely on the strict aspects of the political process. Along these lines, the views system may provide useful illustrations of these trends and their relation to violence, an important tool that, if further developed, could prove useful to multilateral and regional actors supporting the reconciliation, recovery, and prevention efforts. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chaitani, and of course also Cecilia Marcos for a very important discussion and concluding remarks. We will now open the floor to questions from the audience, and I see that we've gotten a couple so far. One has already been answered in the chat. But the next one is a question from Robert Boswell, saying, excellent presentations, and a question for Håvard. I was wondering what kind of cross-validation was used for views, k-fold, walk forward, etc. Also, what specific subannual indicators were used for your 3-month forecasting models?
Oh, thanks. That's an excellent question. So in views so far, we've been using what we call leave the future out cross-validation. It's not really cross-validation. So we train on data up to a given point in time, and then we produce forecasts for what's the future relative to that point in time. So we split the data temporally, not spatially. We've been using that because we find that to be the most realistic test of predictive performance. So what we are really interested in when we evaluate. So when we present forecast, we present our forecast for 3 or 12 or 36 months into the future. We want some realistic test of what performance over that window. So that's why we use this leave the future out partitioning. We've come to realize that there are some disadvantages of relying solely on that. We think doing k-fold cross-validation is probably necessary to remove some there are some parts of the system that can be optimized, and cross-validation could help, because so one problem with random forest models and other very flexible models is that they fit data really, they fit the historical data really well. And since conflict is so persistent in many places in the Middle East and Africa, the models tend to fit a bit to the existing conflict patterns. So I think cross-validation is necessary to make the models even more robust than they are. As for specific subannual indicators used for 3-month forecasting models, we are using the most important predictors are the USDP past conflict of each of these 3 types. We also use data on election and coups from the RAIN project. We use data on protests from ACLED. We also expanding the use of ACLED data on protest and violence. That's not in production yet, but we hope to fit that into production soon. We have some warnings from the crisis watch that we use, but that's the most important predictors that change monthly. Or for subannual in, yes, and we also have some drought and growing season indicators that Paula has been working on.
Thank you very much. Unless there are any more questions from the audience, I know we actually have some internal ones here as well, and I will hand over to Professor Anthony. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I was just wondering for Paola, and I think that's sort of a question generally in our field. You know, you've shown these results for these sort of very powerful machine learning tools. Do you think we are sort of in this prediction world we're at? Do you think that the next big steps will come from more and better sort of machine learning tools, or do you think that the improvement will come mainly from sort of better data? So if we're thinking about sort of where we should be investing in prediction in the future, do you think we should make more of a data investment or more of a machine learning investment? That would be sort of interesting to hear what you think about that.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's, I think the answer is different according to the level of analysis that we are looking at. This is only my understanding, of course. So I think there has been a lot of improvement on gathering disaggregated data, both over time and over space. But I think we can still achieve a lot and improve a lot in terms of integrating these data efforts into modeling approaches when it comes to the pre-grid level, so disaggregated modeling of conflicts. For example, I've been working on these drought indicators, and we see that at the pre-grid level, they do contribute to conflict forecasting. But in general, I would say that the answer that we would need both, because complex models, they tend to perform very, very well. So investing into neural networks, recurrent or convolutional neural networks is really needed if we want to increase the performance, I think. But I see a strong trade-off, because if we only invest on these complex models, we tend to lose understanding. And so the risk is that we only see this these great forecasting exercises, but that do not really improve theoretical innovation. And I think in this field, it's especially important to also boost innovation in terms of understanding and theory advancements to what is driving or what is promising in terms of understanding the drivers of conflict. And in that sense, data-driven approaches are needed and very useful, I think. Sorry, I didn't give a yes or no answer, but I hope this kind of answers your question.
Thank you so much. Professor Metanik, I believe you had a question for Dr. Shaitani as well. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it sort of links in. I see sort of another sort of question here in the chat about sort of the, you know, where have we seen these models in the real world? And Yusuf has some experience with that. So maybe Yusuf, could you sort of maybe speak about your experiences with sort of these forecasting models in the field and where you think they are most useful from your perspective as a practitioner?
Well, that's a very good question. These models, more or less, the results that they present are very sensitive. So what we do usually when we engage with risk units, we basically use them to establish a dialogue that is very much based on these on the different dimensions that are being used to try to depoliticize basically some of the issues related to you know, to conflict. Obviously, this is still new, and also with our interlocutors. I mean, these are complex models, not easily to decipher or to deploy. And here basically we depend on partnerships like the one with Prio to try as much as possible present a very transparent model with basically publicly available data to try to basically push the envelope on the humanitarian, on the development, as well as the peace building dimensions. Over.
Thank you very much. So we are now getting some questions from the audience as well, along with a lovely compliment of what's COVID beard. The first one is a question about integrating expert survey data. Professor Hegre, would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, so we didn't present the views expert survey yet because although we've been working on this for a couple of years, it's only very recently that we accumulated enough data to be able to evaluate the predictions from expert surveys formally the way that we do with all our own models. But we've been, so Angelica has been in charge of that part of the views project. We've recruited 60, 70 experts, 1 to 2 experts on every country in Africa, or almost all countries, and asked them a range of questions, some about what are the important stakeholders in a country, what are the important issues, and what happens in terms of interactions over those contested issues between those stakeholders. We also asked them about what do you as an expert think is likely to happen over the next 3 or 12 months in terms of violence of the type that we model in the views project. So we've started some preliminary evaluation of what experts of these expert assessments, and they predict quite well. We still haven't evaluated whether they predict better than views, so I'll keep you in suspense on that. We're quite certain that this is one type of the data additions that Nils mentioned that is valuable. So just to also respond a bit to Nils' questions, I think obtaining new data sources is important. I think there is more to gain from getting better data than from better models. But I think we need to work on both fronts because new and better data often raises the need for better models. that was quick on the expert survey. Next year we will present the expert survey full scale probably.
Thank you very much. Next question is an open one to all the panelists. Reading, as a practitioner working on violence and atrocity prevention initiatives on the ground in several countries, I'm curious to learn about times when these models have been used in violence prevention or mitigation initiatives. Can any of the speakers give us some examples?
Sorry, I missed, I couldn't hear what you said, Angelica, so I'm not sure.
Which question in the chat? Because question 4, which one?
Question 4.
Sorry, my internet connection is a bit unstable. Question number.
Question number
4.
4.
Yeah, I think Josef responded to that quite well. I think there's been a significant change over the past 5 years in the policy community as to the value of systems like the ones that Nils is developing and the views system. So I think there's been a realization in the policy community that it's useful to have something which is transparent and open source based and based on hard methods in the sense that it's one advantage of views and other systems that the rules of the game are set by the evaluation strategies and the performance metrics and so forth. We try to keep politics completely out of it. And I think that, of course, I mean, our own political agenda out of it, that, and also try to be blind to something that is more intuitive observations. And some of that is a weakness of the system, but it's also a strength because there is some objective reference to what we're doing. But in any case, I think there is a fundamental change in UN agencies, for instance, with respect to using these tools. So we are really excited to be in communication with Josef's team and with other teams to do this, and we'll see what comes out of it. So
if I could just maybe add to this, I think that most European states and the US and then international organizations like the EU, they will have some form of quantitative risk assessment that is in place. So in the US context, it would probably be the Political Instability Task Force. On the EU level, there is a predictive model. France, Germany is investing quite a lot into predictive models of conflict. So there are more and more actors in that space that are investing into this.
Thank you. We also received a follow-up question on how we may enhance interpretability of the models. Would any of the panelists dive into that?
Yeah, so if I could speak to that real quickly, I think that that's a major challenge about the interpretability, and usually and Hovat and others can speak to this, but I think having sort of individuals who are really good at making this connection between the policy world and sort of more sort of academics, I think are super helpful, and where this has been a success, where people have successfully implemented these models, usually they have these individuals that are really good at exactly understanding what the policymaker needs, but also understanding what is happening in the prediction models. And I think there's lots of space for people to fill these positions, because I think they're going to be necessary in the future.
Thank you very much. So we are actually running out of time. We won't have time for the last questions, but please don't hesitate to reach out to us over email. You can contact views@pcr.uu.se, and I'll be happy to forward any questions. And with that, I just want to direct a warm thank you to all of our panelists and all of the participants joining us today. Thank you all so much, and I wish you all a lovely day. Thank you very much.